Over the last couple of days, we've been talking about the relationship of the Mosaic Law, the Old Testament law, to the idea of salvation by works, and last of all, salvation by grace. The conflict we sometimes get into is we say we're not saved by law, we're saved by grace. And that's true essentially, because what the law says is that in order to be saved by the law, you have to work out things perfectly. In other words, you have to look at all 613 commandments that are given in the Old Testament, and you have to live up to every one of them. It was Jesus who said, I haven't come to revoke or annul the law, I've come to fulfill it. And so what we find is that Jesus fulfilled it, number one, because he lived out the law perfectly without sin, and therefore became the only one qualified to keep the law. Secondly, when it comes to the ritual obligations of the law, Jesus met all of those sacrificial and behavioral rituals, so that we as Christians don't read the law simply as a standard of moral rectitude. We read the law as a display or a prophetic message of what Christ did and how he fulfilled what was needful on my part towards God. And that's why he says in verse 10 of our reading that whoever keeps the law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. And he goes on to explain. He says, for he who said do not commit adultery also said do not murder. And if you do not commit adultery, but do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. And it's easy to miss the point here, because he's not talking about adultery versus murder or any other thing of that nature. What he's simply saying is you have to understand that if you break one principle of the law, you've broken the entirety of the law. And he uses the two examples. In fact, he's really, I think, referring back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount when he said, we've all committed adultery in our mind, we've all committed murder in our hearts, so essentially we're all guilty before God. And really, as we've talked about what was in the Sermon on the Mount, as well as what James is telling us here, he's kind of trying to dispel any sense of our own righteousness, that somehow we can stand before God based upon what we have done. That's why he goes on to say in verse 12 that we need to speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. And this is something that kind of confuses people, because what do you mean we're going to be judged? Well, it doesn't mean that our soul is going to be weighed in terms of eternity based upon how well we act, but rather we're going to be evaluated by God. That God constantly looking at us and he's saying, are you walking up to the standards of righteousness as I've given them to you? And the truth of it is, you and I stumble at that frequently. That's something he brings up later on in chapter 3, that we all stumble all the time. And if we don't do it by our actions, we may do it with our words. If we don't do it with our words, we may do it with our thoughts. And that becomes the challenge, even to control my thought life. But we have to understand that, as he said back in chapter 1 and verse 25, he said, but the one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides by it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. What he's talking about is looking intently at this law of love, loving God and loving our neighbor. If we look intently, this is a law that if we follow, it sets us free. It doesn't bind us. And so you have this concept culturally where people feel like, wow, I feel so hemmed in by all these rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are challenging, especially I'm going to love God above everything else in my life, and I'm going to love my neighbor as I love and care for myself. Those are challenging things, because it means that I have to surrender my life to him and say, Lord, let me be a follower of Jesus in my relational dynamics. You know, it's easy to say I love God with my mind. It's much harder to say I love God, and the evidence of it is how I treat other people around me. And it's my relationship with other people that brings me into constant conflict. I just think about just driving in the car yesterday. I drove across state, and I wonder about how other people got their driver's license. And I'm sure that they look at me sometimes and wonder how I got mine. And that's the whole point. I can see their guilt very clearly. It's easy to become an expert in somebody else's transgressions. It's a harder thing to see your own. And that's, I think, the goal. I need to be an expert about my own shortcomings and failings. I need to study those and look intently at those in light of God's righteousness. In the passage in chapter 1 and verse 25 I just read a moment ago, he's talking about looking into the Word of God and using it as a mirror that reflects my vision of myself, my understanding of myself, not one that I'm using to point out at other people. And this becomes a problem. As Christians, we can often use the Bible as a spotlight to identify other people's shortcomings and failings, but we don't use it as a mirror to illuminate our own. In fact, I think about these kind of makeup mirrors that women have with not only they magnified, but they have lights around them so you can really see the pores and the errors in your face, the flaws in your being. Well, that's essentially what the Word of God does. And the deeper you look into it, the more apparent it becomes that you are a sinner saved by grace. And when I see people who have a judgmental, critical attitude, they may know the Bible forward and backwards in their mind, but it has never made that short journey, as someone once put it, the 18-inch journey from my head into my heart. And that's the thing that God really wants me to focus on. That in a way, it's almost like James says that we're to love and live in our life in a way that really proves that you expect to give an answer to God someday for the way that you've treated other people and how you've lived a life. You know, there's none of us who can sit back and say, well, I couldn't help myself, it wasn't my fault, because the cross of Christ empowers me. It frees me from the bondage of the law and brings me into the freedom of Christ. We're under the law of liberty, which basically says you have been set free from the things that once made it impossible for you to live a righteous life. And now, as you follow Christ, you will find that righteousness will follow after you. As the psalmist said, surely blessing and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Why are they going to follow you? Because you are following Christ. So let's work on that this week, okay? Many blessings. Go in His grace.